in a first sit-down interview since becoming the Democratic presidential nominee, Kamala Harris offered her most expansive explanation to date on why she's changed some of her positions on fracking and immigration since her first run for president. But the US Vice President, who was interviewed alongside her running mate, Governor Tim Walz, told CNN she would name a Republican to serve in a cabinet if elected, saying it would be to the benefit of the American public. She also brushed off Donald Trump's questioning of her racial identity and described for the first time President Joe Biden's telephone call informing her he was planning to abandon his bid for a second term after his disastrous debate performance. She stopped short, though, of saying she would alter Biden's policy towards arms sales to Israel. Meanwhile, amidst this tight competition between Kamala Harris and former US President Donald Trump, a new survey reveals that the US Vice President has closed the gap in many key swing states just a month after launching her election campaign. For further clarity on the matter, we have with us Benji Hyer joining us from Ground Zero. Benji, this interview was being seen as a key test of Kamala Harris's credibility after what many are calling a prolonged honeymoon that has seen a surge ahead of Donald Trump in opinion polls. But Benji, has Kamala Harris provided one of the clearest looks into her positions and her plans for the presidency? What are you picking up on?
Look, I think this performance was solid if unspectacular, and that's ultimately what she needed to do. You know, this wasn't about necessarily propelling her so far forward in terms of the momentum that puts her on track for victory. One interview is unlikely to do that, but she wanted to avoid any slip-ups that could spoil her campaign, and I think she has managed to do that in some of the answers that she gave. You know, Kamala Harris is known for asking the questions. A former prosecutor, a former senator, now it was her opportunity to answer them and try to swat away some of the accusations she's been facing from her critics that she's been hiding from the press during the first couple of weeks of this campaign. Some of the main highlights, I think, to come from this. I mean, you named a few before in terms of her stance on Israel, her admission that she'd take a Republican in her cabinet, and indeed swatting away condemnation, racially targeted condemnation from Donald Trump. I think that the main issues that American people will be focusing on are the economy, and she was asked about her plan on day one, and also why all these ideas that she's come up with haven't already been implemented under the Biden administration. She's been vice president after all. Well, to that, she says that first she needed to make sure the country recovered from the pandemic, but the inflation is down and she will continue with those policies. A second issue was immigration. This was key because what people don't necessarily know is that it was years ago an interview took place in which she was pressed on the crisis at the southern border, migrants crossing in their thousands, and she gave an answer which created this perception in the mind of many Americans that she wasn't strong at interviews, and this was a chance for her to put that record straight. She says at the border she would enforce laws, and the reason that they haven't been able to be harsher in terms of their border policy isn't because of Joe Biden, but instead because of Donald Trump and his position on a border bill that didn't pass through Congress. And the third, I think, main takeaway on policy was to do with fracking, mainly a domestic issue in the US, producing of natural gas, but still very important when talking about America's place on the world vis-a-vis energy or climate change. She said at one point she wanted to put an end to fracking once and for all. She has since reversed that position, mainly in a ways to not lose votes in states where fracking is so important to the economy, like Pennsylvania. And I think it's that has allowed the likes of Donald Trump to brand her as a chameleon for what he sees as her shifting policy positions.
Well, but the choice of CNN as the outlet and Bash as the interviewer has also been criticized by Trump supporters. In fact, many MAGA supporters claim that both are sympathetic to Democrats and were unlikely to pose hard questions. But would you disagree, Benji?
Well, I don't think there were any questions which were, overly scrutinous, but that is a very kind of American style of television. Frankly, this interview was split up. It wasn't intense. It was dotted around with light-hearted questions about family, clips of them walking around a diner. That was the theme and the tone of the interview. It was very different to, a court session or something like that. But if you think about American media, American politics. This is a very polarized nation. It was unlikely that Kamala Harris was going to go on a network which was unfavorable towards her. In a similar vein, Donald Trump is often featured on television, but he's on the likes of Fox News, a more conservative network. He has, credit to him, given far more media appearances. He has taken news conferences, press conferences, but the caveat, of course, is that many of those have been littered with falsehoods and baseless attacks on his opponents, which he's continued in the past 24 hours or so. So I'm thinking the Democrats will be pleasantly relieved that CNN did not necessarily go as hard as they might have feared, and she remained unscathed from this experience, even though I'm sure she will cop a huge amount more criticism from Donald Trump in spite of the fact that she's taken this interview.
Well, this was Kamala Harris's first major interview since becoming the Democratic presidential nominee, and her delay in facing interviews has contrasted with Trump. As Benji has explained, Trump has staged a rash of recent media appearances. This includes Fox News and Newsmax, two of his favorite outlets, to voice live on-air criticisms of Harris's acceptance speech at the DNC last week. But as always, Benji Hyer, thank you so much for joining us with the latest from Ground Zero.